Welcome back to our House Calls series, From Confusion to Clarity. Well, today we're actually going to be talking about concerns and confusions. Barry, there is a lot of concerns and confusions out there. The title is sort of self-explanatory. Do you remember on our first initial videos where we talked about our initial fears and how that led to, it was just a natural progression of concerns, but a lot of confusion. Do you think that a lot of other Canadians are experiencing the same things that we did?
I suspect they are, and I was almost going to test our audience and say, to reflect upon the questions we're going to ask you. So, for example, are you concerned that the quality of your life has suffered during the pandemic? Are you anxious to return to your previous normal life?
Yeah, for example, are you also concerned then about the underlying science that was used for many of these measures? You know, it's not very transparent about that.
Yeah, are you concerned that a lot of the predictions made by the experts haven't come true quite exactly as they said they would? Has that left you a little bit confused?
Concerned about, like, does social distancing and the masks work? Are they effective? That's a big one for me. I'm concerned about that, and I'm confused if they even work.
Yeah, and after all these many months, do you feel that you understand viruses, this virus, the vaccines, and our immune system in general, as well as you think you should at this point?
You know, I answered yes to all of them, many of them for sure, and I suspect that many more have, and that's why we created this series, really, to go from confusion to clarity, because there are a lot of unanswered questions out there, and like I had said initially, if we're caught in a state of confusion, we don't know where we're going. We don't have, clear answers to the questions that we have, and so we just can't move forward with any of this.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, again, asked our audience, are you confused about or concerned about the financial state of affairs for yourself or the country as a whole, about the social implications of many of the measures that have been used during the pandemic? How are we going to be able to pay for all of this? Are you concerned about the erosion of your freedom or the ability to question our political authorities?
Yes, I mean, that's exactly right. We haven't even talked about the debt. It's over $1 trillion. I mean, it's unreal. There are rights and freedoms, how they've slowly disappeared. So, Barry, for you, though, as an experienced physician, when did you first start to become concerned about, like, for example, the accuracy of the reporting of what was going on?
Well, it happened, fairly early on for me. I know that we often in society trust specialists a lot, and rightfully so. As a family doctor, a generalist, I trusted in specialists to relate information to me and to help me in doing my job. But I was a bit concerned that although a lot of people were diving deeply into specialty areas, no one was really looking at the big picture. And as a generalist, I tend to look at the forest as opposed to the trees. I look at the bigger picture. And I'm not an expert in anything. I heard a lot from experts, but I'm not an expert in anything. And I don't say that with false modesty, because I think that the forest perspective can be very valuable. Yes, we need specialists and experts, but sometimes the generalist can see things that we miss if we're only looking at individual trees.
I like your analogy about the forest through the trees. For my part, when I first became, I guess, concerned, and like I'm not a specialist by any means, when I started to look at the criteria for the declarations of emergency. I was curious for our own province of Ontario, and I discovered that it hadn't met any of the criteria. And then out of sheer curiosity, like many, many months later, I looked at all of the other provinces and territory, and I was shocked that none of them had met that. And so I was just thinking, well, how can they be implementing these measures when the criteria hasn't been met? And if the criteria hasn't been met, does that mean that these declarations of emergency are illegal? And one would say yes, that they are.
Well, I agree. Like when you stand back and look at the big picture, you have to ask yourself questions. It reminded me of an analogy I had about a woman coming to see me who was concerned that she was depressed because her marriage wasn't going well. And as I interviewed her, she said, well, my husband is working very, very hard at work. He's going through a very busy time. He isn't home very often. When he is, he's usually distracted on the phone with someone else, taking a call in a different room. We haven't been on holidays for over a year, and yet he's going away on business trips every weekend and says there's no point in me joining him because all he does is work. Our sex life has gone down the drain. I see receipts in his wallet for stores he doesn't normally go to. I could smell some perfume or different aftershave on his shirt. I'm really worried that our marriage is falling apart. And I stood back thinking, okay, so she could probably explain each one of those on the basis of him doing a lot of overtime at work. And that might well be the case. But as a generalist, I thought, it strikes me there's a possibility he might be having an affair. Now, that's not something that she really wants to explore, obviously for good reasons, but I explained to her that perhaps she needs to think about discussing that with him, not accusing him of having an affair, but perhaps approaching him and saying, look, honey, I think our relationship is suffering a bit because of your work. I know I'm not always a perfect wife, but are you doing okay? Because I'm feeling pretty depressed about where our marriage is going. Are we going to be okay as a couple? And he's going to respond one of two ways. He's either going to say, oh, I'm so worried that you're having, that you're depressed. I feel so badly about it. Look, call my boss and find out how much work we're doing. I'm going to call him myself and I'm going to cut back on it. No more business trips. We're going to go away on holidays. I'll show you the receipts for the things I bought because they were for fellow coworkers who are doing overtime, etc. Or he might say, how dare you accuse me of having an affair? You know, you're not a perfect wife either. You're paranoid. This is all nonsense. Get that out of your head. I'm doing all this for you. Well, which husband do you think is more likely having the affair? And then I would ask you, what has been the response of our authorities? Have they been as transparent as the first husband? Or have they been more like the second husband where you don't dare ask questions? You just do as you're told, and if you have any other thoughts than what our official narrative is, well, you're paranoid, you're a conspiracy theorist, etc.
Or the other third obvious scenario to me is that the wife could stay in denial. Really, because denial is a powerful survival strategy technique. You know, there are things that we don't want to admit because if we do, then we have to take action.
Absolutely.
You know, I wanted to just change course a bit. I know this is like almost 2 years ago, but do you remember the footage coming out of China?
Yeah, this is a good example of situation where you could see the tree, but I stood back and looked at the forest.
Yes.
Much like the wife wasn't prepared to, but I needed to.
Yeah.
So I remember the first video footage was really quite scary. You saw people walking in the street, suddenly collapsing, looked like they were dying, and they'd be scooped up by people wearing hazmat suits and either put in a bag or on a stretcher and wheeled off. And I thought, that's kind of odd. How can someone be so sick they can still get up out of bed, get dressed, go downstairs, walk in the street, and then all of a sudden collapse? It didn't strike me as being accurate. I mean, did these people not have friends or family? Did they not have a phone to call someone? Don't they have ambulances in Wuhan? So to me, it looked somewhat staged, almost theatrical. And the truth is, I mean, nothing against the Chinese people, but we know China is a communist country, so the flow of information is going to be restricted there. So I wasn't sure about the accuracy of what we were seeing. For example, again, the blame went to ordinary Chinese people involved in the wet market, and that was the source of the virus. It only was many months later that we actually heard that in fact there was an experimental virology lab in Wuhan itself.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned your perspective on the footage, it being staged. I hadn't picked that up at all until months and months later when I watched it probably for the third or fourth time. So I think I was literally caught in that stage of hypnosis. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And that actually added to my fear. It did, hands down.
Yeah, I think it was important that we be able to stand back and look at things a little more objectively because it was a very emotional time. We were all scared and it was easy to kind of get overwhelmed by one tree and not look at the forest. There was, for example, early on a lot of confusion about how is this virus spread? Is it by fomites, you know, on surfaces that you touch? Is it airborne? Is it a respiratory droplet? It was very unclear. And you know, they also tended to invoke more fear because they made the case fatality rates and mortality rates very high. But those are ratios. So it's easy to know the numerator, how many deaths there were, but the denominator, how many people actually got exposed to the virus or got sick, is important to know. Otherwise, you can't know the ratio. So unfortunately, because we didn't know how many people were exposed and felt perfectly well, the rate of mortality and case fatality was artificially very high, and that wasn't explained to us. And unfortunately, when that wasn't explained well, it just ramped up the fear tremendously.
You know, I remember my husband and I seeing videos of other doctors in the States in 2020, I believe. It's hard to believe we're almost 2 years into this. And they were talking about how to calculate that ratio. And I remember we were talking to ourselves. We said, well, how is anybody to know this, right? And so we were grateful for that information. What else did I want to say? Yeah, there's also actually the question of if the virus has been isolated or not. And we're going to deal with that in our Follow the Science section. There's also then the question of the name of the virus, which is confusing. Is it COVID, COVID-19? Is it a coronavirus? Is it SARS-CoV-2? I mean, that's confusing for people.
Yeah, I think there's other stuff coming from around the world that I find confusing as well.
Yeah.
The high mortality rates in Italy. And I kind of stood back for a second and said, well, is there anything unique about Italy? I don't know anything about their healthcare system. I don't know how much chaos there was there. I did know that Italy had a very old population compared to most countries in the world. And a lot of the elderly stayed in people's homes as opposed to nursing homes. Could that be affecting the mortality rates? I know that an awful lot of the cases occurred in one region, I think in the Lombardy region.
Yes.
So did that affect the numbers? So I tried to keep an open mind and assume that just because things looked bad in Italy didn't mean they're necessarily going to be bad for everybody and not necessarily for Canada. I remember hearing one story again highlighting the emotionality of it. One physician in Italy talking about the fact that he ran out of ventilators and he couldn't put an elderly woman on a ventilator and she died 3 hours later. And I thought to myself, anyone who would die within 3 hours without a ventilator, who's elderly and has other medical troubles, it wouldn't matter if you put them on a ventilator or not. Unfortunately, they were going to succumb to their illness. So it was a little disingenuous to make it sound like a ventilator would have made any difference, because I doubt that it would have.
So you see, most people like us who aren't physicians wouldn't have any clue about that. We're literally just believing what we're being told. I mean, we don't expect the media to lie. We know that there's concerns now with what the media is actually reporting. And for that region, for that Lombardy region, they have, and what most people don't realize, they have the highest of air pollution in Italy. And so that could have been a contributing factor, but nobody was mentioning that. And yes, it was extremely devastating. Like, we have a dear friend who lives in Rome, and when her and I had the conversation early on, she was saying that they've lost an entire generation, and it was very traumatizing for them. And it is very traumatizing to lose anybody.
Yeah, it is, and obviously emotion can affect us a lot.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, there was one situation in which we could have eliminated emotion because we had a situation of almost a perfect lab experiment, and that was the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess.
Yes.
So this was a ship that had 3,800 people on board, 1,100 staff, 2,700 passengers, many of whom I'm assuming would have been over 60, as is typical for cruise ships. And it was confined out to the sea for 2 weeks, and they knew that the coronavirus was on board. And despite the fact that they're basically isolated and all these 3,800 people are sharing the same facility, sometimes isolated in their own room for sure, but their mortality rate was only 0.35%. And that's phenomenally low considering the age of the population on board. There were no ICUs, etc. So that really should have taught us something about the case fatality and mortality rates. And 0.35% is significantly lower than the 5 to 10% we were initially told when the virus first came out.
Yes, exactly. You know what, I think I'd like to just wrap this up, because there are a lot of scenarios that we could cover for confusion right now, and let's just pick this up in the next video. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I think the next video what we'll do maybe is talk about things closer to home here in Canada itself, things that I found confusing, just like I found the international stuff somewhat confusing as well.
You make a good distinction, because when this first happened, really there wasn't anything in Canada, because we could see it coming to us first from around the world, from over in Europe, and so we were watching that, and that impact and the ripple effect was delayed. And so the next video we'll be talking about
Sounds good.
Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula.
Thanks, everyone.